Hi, welcome to another knitting tutorial. To knit this bubblegum top, you will need Jumbo Muffin Soft Laughter. This yarn calls for a 4.5mm needle size, and that is what I'm going to be using. I'm mainly going to be using these two colors, the pink one and the greenish aqua-ish color. So if you already have these two colors, any yarn with these two colors, you can use them as well, because I'll give you the measurements as we work the top together and also explain which part goes where, so you can make adjustments and make it fit your own body type. I'm going to use a long tail cast on, so I'm going to leave a really long tail. I left about twice my waist measurement. And then I'm going to make a slip knot. Put it on the needle. Make sure the long tail is closer to you and your ball of yarn is on the other side. Then I'm going to put my fingers between these yarn threads. Hold the tails down at the bottom. Flip my hand. Now we have one loop on each finger. I'm going to go through the thumb loop upward, then index finger loop downward. Go back to the first loop. Pull down. I hope you can see what I'm doing, because the beginning of the yarn is pink. It looks like my hand color. So I'm going to push these open, then flip my hand. 2 loops here, loop 1, loop 2. Go through loop 1 upward, loop 2 downward. Then go back to loop 1 again. Pull down. Loop 1 up, loop 2 down, back to 1, pull down. Up, down, back. Up, down, back. Okay, so you're going to keep doing that until this length gets to your waist measurement. I'm going to make this about 80 centimeters. So here it says 19 stitches is 10 centimeters. So 19 times 8 is 152. So that's how many stitches I'm going to cast on. So go ahead and cast on the number of stitches you need, and I'm going to meet you back here. Now that I've got 152 stitches, I'm going to join in the round. But first, you're going to make sure these bumps are facing inward. So make sure they're not twisted and all of them are facing inward. So make sure your tail is on the right needle. And then I'm going to start knitting from the first stitch. Some people place their marker like this and then they knit. So you can do that, but I'm going to knit my first stitch and then I'm going to place marker on the first stitch. So to knit a stitch, you're going to go through the front of the loop upward. Let me just bring it closer. So I'm going to insert my right needle through the front of the first stitch upward. Then wrap yarn around the right needle from back, left, front. And then bring the new loop, this new loop, through the original one. And because this is the first stitch, I'm going to pull the yarn really tight to make sure it's joined properly. And then I'm going to mark the first stitch. Alright, so I've marked the first stitch. That's the first stitch. of round 1. The second stitch is a purl stitch. I'm going to bring yarn around needle 2. So bring yarn to the front, and then I'm going to purl the next stitch. To purl a stitch, we're still going to go through the front loop, but downward. Wrap yarn around needle 2 just like before, and then pull the new loop through the original one. The third stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to bring yarn to the back and knit the next stitch. Fourth stitch is a purl stitch. Bring yarn to the front, purl the next stitch. If any time you lost track, you can look at these stitches here. So the one with the bump is a purl stitch. The one without the bump is a knit stitch. So that's a purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. So I just purled a stitch. That means next I should do a knit stitch. And next stitch is a purl stitch. So for the first round, we're just gonna knit 1 stitch and purl 1 stitch. And I'm gonna see you when you get back to your stitch marker. Alright, now I'm back to the first stitch. I'm going to bring this stitch marker to the back so it's easier to work the stitch. Remember, the first stitch of the last round is a knit stitch, and we can also double check by checking if there is any bump here. There's no bump, so that's a knit stitch. So we're going to knit the knits and purl the purls. So knit the knit stitch. Next stitch is a purl stitch. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the front and purl the next stitch. Next stitch is the knit stitch. Bring yarn to the back, knit the next stitch. Purl the next stitch. So this is what we're going to do for the next few rounds. You're just going to knit the knit stitch and purl the purl stitch. And after you finish the second round and get back to the stitch marker, you're going to directly start knitting the first stitch and then purl the next stitch. So right now we're at the ribbing section. So depending on how wide you want your ribbing band to be, you can do as many rounds as you like. I've done 5 rows here. This marked stitch is the first stitch of the first row. That's the cast on stitch. That's the first stitch of the first row. First stitch of the second row. Third, fourth, fifth. So I should stop at this stitch because that's the first stitch. So I have 2 stitches left here. I'm gonna finish those 2 stitches. Now we've finished the ribbing. The next stitch is the first stitch of the main pattern. So from the next stitch, I'm just gonna knit every stitch. Knit the next stitch. So there's no purl stitch, just continue knitting like this. So that's the bottom of your top. Keep working your way up It depends on how long you want your top to be around your waist. If you're gonna wear it like lower, then you'll need to work more rows. If you want it to be high up, like super cropped version, you can work fewer rows. So for me, this top is gonna be pretty cropped. I kept knitting until it reached the center of my chest. This is 30 rows, which is about 11 centimeters. Next, we're gonna cast off the back area and continue knitting at the front. Now, I know I have 152 stitches. I'm gonna count out half of it, which is 76 stitches from this first stitch here. Okay, so now I've got 76 stitches on each side of the stitch marker. This is gonna be the back panel and this is gonna be the front. So I'm gonna cast off these stitches at the back. So that's the first stitch of row 30. That's the last one. We're gonna cast off the next 76 stitches. But before that, I'm gonna have to ask you to undo your last stitch because we're gonna do it differently so our work looks neater. I'm gonna insert my left needle in the stitch that's below the last stitch from the front. Then take one stitch off the right needle. So we undid that last stitch because we're going to do an increase in that stitch. So knit as normal. But don't take it off the tip yet. Take your right needle to the back and knit a stitch again through the back loop. Knit the next stitch so we can cast off the increased stitch. Now just pull that stitch we've increased over the last stitch we just knitted. From there, we just repeat the same thing. Knit the next stitch and cast off the previous stitch by pulling it over the new stitch. Knit one, cast off the one before that. So continue doing this, and I'm gonna see you when you get to the stitch marker. Now I still have one more stitch left before the stitch marker, so I'm gonna knit the next stitch and bind this off. I just bind it off. Okay, now if I place this one on my left needle, you should have half of your total stitch number, which for me is 76 stitches. So next, we're just gonna knit the front back and forth, and we'll also do some decrease on both sides. Place the stitch back on the needle. The first stitch is already done, so I'm gonna make a decrease in the next two stitches. On the beginning of the row, I'm just going to do a knit 2 together. So I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches together. Just treat them as one stitch and knit them together. Then I'm just gonna knit every stitch across until you have 3 stitches left at the end of the row. Now that I've got 3 stitches, I'm gonna decrease here. To mirror the knit 2 together we did at the beginning of the row, I use SSK. So I'm gonna insert my needle into the next stitch as if to knit, and then just take it off the left needle, slip the next one as if to knit, take it off the needle, and then insert your left needle back through the front of those 2 stitches and knit through the back loop. Knit the very last stitch. So every time we knit across the row, we're going to do that decrease at the beginning here, and at the end of the row. And on the purl side, on this side, we're just going to purl every stitch. So just purl every stitch across the row. On the knit side, we decrease again after the first stitch. We're going to knit these 2 together. Again, knit across the row until you have 3 stitches left. 3 stitches left. Slip the first stitch knitwise, slip the second one knitwise, insert left needle through the front of those 2 loops, and knit the stitch. Knit your last stitch. Okay, and then on the purl side, just purl every stitch. This yarn is going to change color again, but I don't want that color, so to manually change color, I just cut this yarn, directly knit from the next row using the color I want. I actually did 30 decrease rows, and that's about 11 centimeters again. And the stitches across is about 24 centimeters. When I try it on, my armpits are about here. Okay, from the next row, we're gonna start shaping the V-neck. So divide your stitches equally by 2 and mark them apart. Hopefully you have an even number of stitches. If you have an odd number, so we're gonna knit this side first. On this edge, we're gonna keep going up, and on this side, we're gonna use SSK. We're gonna keep decreasing. We're gonna go straight up here, right? So we're not gonna do any decrease here. I'm just gonna knit every stitch until I'm 3 stitches away from the stitch marker. 3 stitches left, do an SSK. knit the last stitch, and then turn. On this side, just purl every stitch, like before. And then just repeat those 2 rows. On the knit side, you're going to knit every stitch until you have 3 stitches left and do an SSK here. And then on the purl side, purl every stitch. So I've done a number of decrease rows here. Sometimes I like to work both sides at the same time so I can try it on as I go, make sure I don't go too far or anything like that. So I put these stitches on a new needle, and then I'm going to grab a new thread, join from here, and start working on this side. So on this side, we decrease here and keep straight here. So at the beginning of the row, I'm going to knit my first stitch just like we did here. Knit my first stitch, and then knit the next 2 stitches together. And then knit all the way across. And then when you're on the other side, you're going to purl every stitch. And then you're just going to keep repeating these 2 rows, decrease at the beginning of the knit rows, and then purl the purl rows. Okay, so I've decreased all the way until I have 3 stitches on both straps. And then I'm going to stop decreasing, just knit every stitch on this side and purl every stitch on the other side. So I kept knitting until this strap is long enough to go over my shoulder and reach the back of the top. So now I need to cast off these stitches. We've done this before for the back of the top. So make sure you're on the knit side. If you're on the purl side, just finish that purl row. So knit your first 2 stitches. Pull the first one over the second one. Knit the next stitch. Pull it over. We've got 1 stitch on the needle. Just cut this yarn, leave enough to sew, and then just pull the yarn through. Do the same for the other strap. When you finished both straps, you can sew them to the back like this, or you can form a cross at the back. Either way, it will look nice. I finished one side. You can see I sewed the strap behind the back. I hit the color pretty good. This is a mistake which can be avoided, so I'm going to show you how to sew like that. By the way, to decide where you can sew your straps, I just divided the stitches at the back into 3. I try to divide them equally by 3, but it's for my stitch number, it's impossible, so it's just almost equally, and I use the stitch markers to mark them. Make sure this strap doesn't twist. I have 3 stitches here, so I'm going to use this one, and this one, these 3 stitches. I'm not going to sew it right on the edge. I'm going to put it a little bit further down so it's more secure. So these 3. The first one, I'm going to look for the V's. I'm going to go through the 3rd V, 1, 2, 3. and I'll just stay in this column. I won't go left or right, just up and down. So I'm gonna go up here. See, it's almost invisible. And then go to the next stitch. The stitch above that. Okay, then I'm gonna go to the right. When I go horizontally, I will just go across one loop. Not two, just one. So this one. So just keep doing this and make sure when you go vertically, just stay in one column. And if you want to go left or right, stay in the top stitches and then go across one loop only. When you're finished on the wrong side, I'll just go across these stitches and just go everywhere because no one's gonna see it. That's okay. And finally, don't forget to weave in the ends.